Close your eyes and try to imagine a Saturday evening in late January 1953. The air across Britain's east coast is brisk but familiar. In thousands of small brick-terraced homes, the ritual of the weekend is in full swing. Coal fires crackle in the hearth, casting a warm, orange glow against the floral wallpaper. Families are huddled around the wireless, listening to the soft crackle of the BBC. Children, exhausted from a day of play, are being tucked into bed under heavy woolen blankets, oblivious to the fact that the very ground beneath them is about to disappear. It was an evening of profound, domestic peace. The kind of peace that a country still recovering from the scars of World War II cherished above all else. But out there, in the vast, churning grey void of the North Sea, an invisible titan was awakening. This was January the 31st, a date that would soon be carved into the collective memory of the British Isles in letters of ice and salt. To understand what happened, you have to understand the physics of a nightmare. A deep, monstrous low-pressure system had formed near Iceland and was now screaming southwards. It wasn't just a storm, it was a surge. Hurricane-force winds were effectively bulldozing the North Sea, shoving a massive wall of water into a bottleneck. As the sea moved south, it had nowhere to go but up. Combined with the natural peak of the spring tides, the water began to pile higher and higher, rising nearly 18 feet above its normal level. It was a meteorological freak of nature, a weather bomb, decades before the term was even coined. And yet, back on land, the silence was deafening. The Meteorological Office in London had seen the barometers plummeting. They knew the pressure was dangerously low. They had even issued warnings about severe conditions. But in 1953, a warning was a piece of paper, or a brief crackle on the radio that most people had already switched off for the night. There was no internet, no emergency alerts on smartphones, no 24-hour news cycle. Television was a luxury for the few, and by the time the sun went down, the transmitters had gone silent. Britain was going to bed in the path of a leviathan, and it was doing so in total, terrifying ignorance. The first blood was drawn not on the coast, but on the high seas. On that Saturday morning, the MV Princess Victoria, a proud ferry crossing from Stranraer to Northern Ireland, found herself in the teeth of the gale. She was built to withstand the Irish Sea, but she wasn't built for this. Massive waves smashed against her stern doors, forcing them open and flooding the car deck. The ship began to list heavily, a dying steel giant in a mountainous sea. By 2000 p.m, the captain, James Ferguson, realised the battle was lost. He stayed on the bridge, a silhouette of duty, as he gave the final order, abandon ship. Of the 179 souls aboard, 133 were swallowed by the freezing depths. Not a single woman or child survived the launch of the lifeboats in those savage conditions. The Princess Victoria was the canary in the coal mine, a grim herald of the carnage that was about to strike the mainland. As night fell, the surge continued its relentless march south, hugging the coastline, looking for a weakness. It reached the Humber estuary, then the shores of Lincolnshire. The sea walls, many of which had been neglected since the war or patched up with nothing more than hope and old concrete, stood like fragile toys against the weight of billions of gallons of salt water. The tide was no longer a cycle of nature, it was a weapon. And as the clocks ticked toward midnight, the people of the east coast remained fast asleep, while the North Sea prepared to reclaim the land. As the clock struck midnight on the final day of January, the North Sea didn't just rise, it erupted. For those living along the low-lying coastlines of Lincolnshire and Norfolk, the first sign of the catastrophe wasn't the sight of water, but the sound. It began as a low, guttural vibration that felt like a heavy freight train passing through the garden. Then it transformed into a thunderous, explosive roar as the ancient sea defences, walls that had stood against the tides for decades, simply vanished under the weight of the surge. Over 1,200 breaches were torn into the coastline in a single night. It was as if the very perimeter of Britain had been liquidated. In the coastal town of Mablethorpe, the sea didn't trickle in. It smashed through the front doors. One moment, families were asleep in the warmth of their linens. The next, they were being lifted toward the ceiling by a freezing black torrent of salt water and debris. The power grid failed almost instantly, plunging entire towns into a pitch-black abyss where the only sensory input was the freezing cold and the terrifying sound of crashing waves inside your own living room. People woke to find their bedside tables floating and their heavy wardrobes toppling over in the current. Further down the coast at Hunstanton, a tragedy of horrific proportions was unfolding. The sea wall here was thought to be impenetrable, but the surge surpassed it by several feet. The water didn't just flood the streets, it scoured the very earth from beneath the houses. Many residents lived in small bungalows near the shore. As the wall collapsed, these houses were hit with the force of a moving mountain. Within minutes, the water was chest-high inside the homes. Parents struggled to lift their children onto kitchen tables, then onto cupboards, and finally onto the rafters of the roof. But for some, there was no high ground left to reach. Imagine the sheer sensory terror of that night. The water wasn't just cold, it was ice slurry, filled with the sharp wreckage of smashed piers, uprooted trees, and the jagged remains of fishing boats. In the darkness, you couldn't see where the street ended and the ocean began. There were no sirens to guide the way, no emergency broadcasts to offer hope. There was only the scream of the wind and the desperate shouts of neighbours calling out to one another across a newly formed inland sea. In Lincolnshire alone, the water travelled 3 miles inland in some places, turning fertile farmland into a salty, drowned wasteland in the blink of an eye. The North Sea had breached the fortress, and it was now the master of the land. As the clock ticked past 1 in the morning, the surge reached the Thames estuary, focusing its concentrated fury on 2 vulnerable communities that stood directly in its path: Canvey Island and Jaywick. These were places defined by hope and post-war resilience, populated by families who had fled the bombed-out ruins of London to find peace in small bungalows and timber-framed prefabs. But that night, their sanctuary became their tomb. Canvey Island, a low-lying expanse of reclaimed land, was home to 11,000 souls. Most of them were sleeping in prefabs, temporary homes built in the shadow of the Blitz. They were never designed to face a mountain of salt water. When the seawall breached at Small Gaines Creek just after midnight, it wasn't a gradual leak. It was a structural failure of catastrophic proportions. A wall of freezing water over 6 feet high roared across the island with the speed of a sprinting horse. Families were literally washed out of their beds. Because many of these homes were single-story bungalows, there was no upstairs to flee to. Imagine the panic of a mother waking up to find her mattress floating, her children screaming in the pitch-black darkness as the water rose to the ceiling in less than 3 minutes. Some tried to climb onto their kitchen tables, only for the water to keep rising, forcing them to punch holes through their own ceilings in a desperate bid to reach the attic space. The cold was a silent killer. This wasn't just water, it was an icy liquid that paralyzed the limbs in seconds. In the darkness, the prefabricated houses, light and poorly anchored, began to lift off their foundations. They floated like macabre rafts through the streets, colliding with each other and breaking apart under the relentless pressure of the tide. 58 people died on Canvey Island that night, many of them young children and the elderly, unable to fight the current or survive the profound hypothermia that set in as they clung to their rooftops in the howling wind. Further down the coast at Jaywick, a similar horror was unfolding. This tiny village of wooden chalets was trapped between the breached seawall and the flooded marshes behind it. The residents were caught in a pincer movement of water. 37 people perished there, nearly 5% of the entire population. Entire families were simply erased. One resident later recalled the sound of the chalets splintering, a high-pitched, agonizing crack of wood that signaled the end of a home. Bodies were found days later, some tangled in the tops of trees, others washed miles out into the North Sea. It was a scene of total, primitive devastation that left the nation in a state of collective shock. The sea hadn't just flooded these towns, it had attempted to delete them from the map. In the coldest, darkest hours before the dawn of February the 1st, as the North Sea continued to claw at the edges of Britain, a different kind of force began to push back. It wasn't the force of machines or government orders, it was the raw, unyielding courage of ordinary men and women. When the lights went out and the sirens failed, the only thing standing between hundreds of families and a watery grave was the bravery of a neighbour, a local bobby, or a passing stranger. These were the sentinels in the black water, people who looked into the abyss and refused to blink. Consider the harrowing story of Elsie Lofts at the Anchor Hotel in Harwich. Imagine the sensory overload, the smell of brine, the freezing air, and then a sound like 1,000 freight trains colliding. When the sea exploded through the cellar doors, it didn't just flood the room, it turned the hotel into a vortex. Elsie's husband was dragged down into the blackness of the cellar in a heartbeat. Elsie herself was lifted by the sheer physical weight of the surge, carried up the stairs by the rising tide without her feet ever touching a single step. She reached the top just as the heavy doors slammed shut, sealing her husband in a tomb of ice-cold salt water. In the suffocating silence that followed, her screams were the only sound against the howling wind. It was a tragedy repeated in 100 different ways across the coast, yet amidst such grief, heroism flickered to life. In the flooded streets of Lincolnshire, 2 police officers, Charles Lewis and Leonard Deptford, became living legends. They didn't wait for orders. They waded into water that was thick with floating debris and jagged ice, water that reached their chests and threatened to pull them under at every step. Lewis saw an elderly couple being swept away by a current so strong it was stripping the bark off trees. Without a second thought, he dived from a first-floor window into the freezing torrent to reach them. He held them against the surge for hours, his body a human anchor, until help arrived. For their actions that night, both men were awarded the George Medal, the highest civilian award for bravery. But for them, the real reward was the lives they had pulled back from the brink. And then there was the unnamed fireman on Canvey Island. Against the strict orders of his superiors, who feared causing a mass panic, he climbed to the top of the station and sounded the air raid siren. It was a sound that hadn't been heard since the darkest days of the Blitz, a sound that triggered a primal instinct in every resident. That one act of defiance saved hundreds. It woke families who were minutes away from being submerged in their sleep, giving them just enough time to scramble onto roofs or into attic spaces. All along the coast, human chains were formed. Men standing neck-deep in the brine, passing shivering children hand over hand to the safety of higher ground. In the face of a disaster that sought to isolate and destroy, the people of Britain chose to hold on to one another. By the time the grey, sunless dawn of Sunday, February the 1st, finally broke across the east coast, the scale of the carnage was laid bare for the world to see. Britain was a nation in shock. Entire towns like Canvey Island and Jaywick had practically vanished beneath the silt-laden waves, with only the jagged outlines of rooftops visible above the water. Bodies were seen floating in the streets alongside family heirlooms, splintered furniture, and the bloated carcasses of thousands of livestock. It was a landscape of total, silent desolation. The government immediately launched Operation King Canute, the largest peacetime rescue and recovery mission in British history. Over 30,000 emergency workers, including soldiers from the British Army and the RAF, were mobilised to plug the 1,200 breaches in the sea walls. Using millions of sandbags and sheer manual labour, they fought to reclaim the land from the retreating tide. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret walked among the survivors in makeshift shelters, offering words of comfort, but the scars were too deep for simple gestures. The final death toll was staggering. 307 lives lost on English soil, and over 1,800 in the Netherlands, where the tragedy reached apocalyptic proportions. Across the North Sea, the total count exceeded 2,400 souls. But beyond the immediate loss of life, the economic and social damage was generational. 24,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged. 160,000 acres of prime English farmland were poisoned by salt water, rendered infertile for years to come. In 1953, the cost was £50 million. In today's terms, that is a staggering blow of over £1.5 billion. For the coastal communities, the recovery wasn't measured in months, but in decades. However, from the mud and the mourning, a new resolve was born. Hard, uncomfortable questions were asked in Parliament. Why was a First World nation so utterly blindsided? Why were sea defences left in such a precarious state after the war? The disaster forced a complete revolution in how Britain viewed the sea. The Meteorological Office was officially given the mandate for storm surge forecasting, leading to a sophisticated warning system that remains one of the best in the world. Building regulations were rewritten, prohibiting flimsy residential construction in high-risk zones. The most enduring legacy, however, is a marvel of modern engineering, the Thames Barrier. Conceived in the wake of 1953 and finally completed in 1982, it stands as a massive silver-toothed guardian of London, ready to rise and block any surge that dares to threaten the capital. Similarly, the Netherlands launched the Delta Works, a project of such immense ambition that it is often called one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. The flood of 1953 was a brutal teacher. It taught us that the sea is not a neighbour to be ignored, but a force that demands our absolute respect. 70 years on, the generation that survived still remembers the sound of the water, the cold that bit into their bones, and the silence of the dawn. In 2013, exactly 60 years later, a surge of equal magnitude hit the east coast, but this time the barriers held. This time, not a single life was lost. The debt owed to those who perished in 1953 was finally, somberly paid. We remember them, not just in monuments, but in every wall that stands and every siren that stays silent.